Good day to you, Inklings, and welcome back to Catawampus Readings, a literary podcast focused on beginnings and introductions. Today we're going to be wrapping up a list of titles that I started way back in November with The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Now, I've seen this book as a childhood staple for most of my life, at least partially because when I was a kid, I owned a copy of an animated feature film by the same name. It was one of my favorites, up there with Charlotte's Web, and I can't even tell you how many times I watched that movie. Of course, I didn't read the book until I was in college, but I was very familiar with the story by then. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the story, here's a spoiler-tastic summary from Amazon. The orphaned Mary Lennox is sullen, ill-tempered, and unloved when she's sent to live with her uncle, Archibald Craven. A man consumed by grief over the death of his wife, Archibald has allowed his sprawling estate on the moors to fall into grim disrepair. It's when Mary begins tending her late aunt's mysterious garden, locked up and neglected for years, that she discovers its life-changing secrets and a flowering rejuvenation of the human spirit. In short, this is a story about a bratty little girl and a bratty little boy and how they make friends with a much nicer child and, as a consequence, become less bratty. It's a wonderful coming-of-age book, teaching me about growing up in the same way that Black Beauty taught me about respect for life in all its forms. An interesting twist in the introduction is this, that it introduces the main character, Mary, more through her circumstances than through herself. I'll show you what I mean. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 1. There is no one left. When Mary Lennox was sent to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everybody said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. It was true, too. She had a thin little face, and a thin little body, and thin light hair and a sour expression. Her hair was yellow, and her face was yellow because she had been born in India and had always been ill in one way or another. Her father had held a position under the English government and had always been very busy and ill himself, and her mother had been a great beauty who cared only to go to parties and amuse herself with gay people. She had not wanted a little girl at all, and when Mary was born, she handed her over to the care of an ayah, who was made to understand that if she wished to please the Mem Sahib, she must keep the child out of sight as much as possible. So when she was a sickly, fretful, ugly little baby, she was kept out of the way, and when she became a sickly, fretful, toddling thing, she was kept out of the way also. She never remembered seeing familiarly anything but the dark faces of her ayah and the other native servants, and as they always obeyed her and gave her her own way in everything, because the Mem Sahib would be angry if she was disturbed by her crying, by the time she was 6 years old, she was as tyrannical and selfish a little pig as had ever lived. The young English governess who came to teach her to read and write disliked her so much that she gave up her place in 3 months, and when other governesses came to try to fill it, they always went away in a shorter time than the first one. So if Mary had not chosen to really want to know how to read books, then she never would have learned at all. One frightfully hot morning, when she was about 9 years old, she awakened feeling very cross, and she became crosser still when she saw that the servant who stood by her bedside was not her ayah. "Why did you come?" she said to the strange woman. "I will not let you stay. Send my ayah to me." The woman looked frightened, but she only stammered that the ayah could not come, and when Mary threw herself into a passion and beat and kicked her, she only looked more frightened and repeated that it was not possible for the ayah to come to the Missi Sahib. There was something mysterious in the air that morning. Nothing was done in the regular order, and several of the native servants seemed to be missing, while those whom Mary saw slunk or hurried about with ashy and scared faces. But no one would tell her anything, and her ayah did not come. She was actually left alone as the morning went on, and at last she wandered out into the garden and began to play by herself under a tree near the veranda. She pretended that she was making a flower bed, and she stuck big scarlet hibiscus blossoms into little heaps of earth, all the while growing more and more angry and muttering to herself things that she would say and the names that she would call Sadie when she returned. "Pig! Pig! Daughter of pigs," she said, because to call a native a pig was the worst insult of all. She was grinding her teeth and saying this over and over again when she heard her mother come out onto the veranda with someone. She was with a fair young man, and they stood talking together in low, strange voices. Mary knew the fair young man, who looked like a boy. She had heard that he was a very young officer who had just come from England. The child stared at him, but she stared most at her mother. She always did this when she had the chance to see her, because the Mem Sahib, Mary used to call her that oftener than anything else, was such a tall, slim, pretty person and wore such lovely clothes. Her hair was like curly silk, and she had a delicate little nose that seemed to be disdaining things, and she had large, laughing eyes. All her clothes were thin and floating, and Mary said they were full of lace. They looked fuller of lace than ever this morning, but the eyes were not laughing at all. They were large and scared and lifted imploringly to the fair boy officer's face. "Is it so very bad? Oh, is it?" Mary heard her say. "Awfully," the young man answered in a trembling voice. "Awfully, Mrs. Lennox. You ought to have gone to the hills more than 2 weeks ago." The Mem Sahib wrung her hands. "I know I ought," she cried. "I only stayed to go to that silly dinner party. Oh, what a fool I was." At that very moment, a loud sound of wailing broke out from the servants' quarters, and she clutched at the young man's arm, and Mary stood shivering from head to foot. The wailing grew wilder and wilder. "What is it? What is it?" Mrs. Lennox gasped. "Someone has died," answered the boy officer. "You did not say it had broken out among your servants." "I did not know," the Mem Sahib cried. "Come with me! Come with me!" And she turned and ran into the house. After that, appalling things happened, and the mysteriousness of the morning was explained to Mary. The cholera had broken out in its most fatal form, and people were dying like flies. The Aya had been taken ill in the night, and it was because she had just died that the servants wailed in the huts. Before the next day, 3 other servants were dead, and the others had run away in terror. There was panic on every side and dying people in all the bungalows. During the confusion and bewilderment of the second day, Mary hid herself in the nursery and was forgotten by everyone. Nobody thought of her, nobody wanted her, and strange things happened of which she knew nothing. Mary alternately cried and slept through the hours. She only knew that people were ill and that she heard mysterious and frightening sounds. Once she crept into the dining room and found it empty, though a partly finished meal was on the table, and chairs and plates looked as if they had been hastily pushed back when the diners rose suddenly for some reason. The child ate some fruit and biscuits, and being thirsty, she drank a glass of wine which stood nearly filled. It was sweet, and she did not know how strong it was. Very soon it made her intensely drowsy, and she went back to her nursery and shut herself in again, frightened by the cries she heard in the huts and by the hurrying sound of feet. The wine made her so sleepy that she could scarcely keep her eyes open, and she lay down on her bed and knew nothing more for a long time. Many things happened during the hours in which she slept so heavily, but she was not disturbed by the wails and the sound of things being carried in and out of the bungalow. When she awakened, she lay and stared at the wall. The house was perfectly still. She had never known it to be so silent before. She heard neither voices nor footsteps, and wondered if everybody had got well of the cholera and all the trouble was over. She wondered also who would take care of her now that her Aya was dead. There would be a new Aya, and perhaps she would know some new stories. Mary had been rather tired of the old ones. She did not cry because her nurse had died. She was not an affectionate child and had never cared much for anyone. The noise and the hurrying about and the wailing over the cholera had frightened her, and she had been angry because no one had seemed to remember that she was alive. Everyone was too panic-stricken to think of a little girl no one was fond of. When people had the cholera, it seemed they remembered nothing but themselves. But if everyone had got well again, surely someone would remember and come look for her. But no one came. And as she lay waiting in the house, it seemed to grow more and more silent. She heard something rustling on the matting, and when she looked down, she saw a little snake gliding along and watching her with eyes like jewels. She was not frightened, because he was a harmless little thing who would not hurt her, and he seemed in a hurry to get out of the room. He slipped under the door as she watched him. "How queer and quiet it is," she said. It sounds as if there were no one in the bungalow but me and the snake." Almost the next minute, she heard footsteps in the compound and then on the veranda. They were men's footsteps, and the men entered the bungalow and talked in low voices. No one went to meet or speak with them, and they seemed to open doors and look into rooms. "What desolation," she heard one say. "That pretty, pretty woman. And I suppose the child, too. I heard there was a child, though no one ever saw her." Mary was standing in the middle of the nursery when they opened the door a few minutes later. She looked an ugly, cross little thing, and was frowning because she was beginning to be hungry and feel disgracefully neglected. The first man who had come in was a large officer she had once seen talking to her father. He looked tired and troubled, and when he saw her, he was so startled that he almost jumped back. "Barney," he cried out, "there's a child here. A child alone, in a place like this. Mercy on us, who is she?" "I am Mary Lennox," the little girl said, drawing herself up very stiffly. She thought the man was very rude to call her father's bungalow a place like this. "I fell asleep when everyone had the cholera, and I have only just wakened up. Why does nobody come?" "It is the child that no one ever saw," exclaimed the man, turning to his companions. "She's actually been forgotten." "Why was I forgotten?" Mary said, stamping her foot. "Why does no one come?" The young man, whose name was Barney, looked at her very sadly. Mary even thought she saw him wink his eyes, as if to wink tears away. "Poor little kid," he said. "There's no one left to come." It was in that strange and sudden way that Mary found out that she had neither father nor mother left, that they had died and been carried away in the night, and that the few native servants who had not also died had left the house as quickly as they could to get out of it, none of them even remembering that there was a Missy Sahib. That was why the place was so quiet. It was true, there was no one in the bungalow but herself and the little rustling snake. That's the end of chapter 1, and I would apologize for running long, but I'm totally not sorry, so sorry not sorry. One of the things that really worked for this introduction is that the author told us what Mary was like. That is, she's small, thin, and sour. And then went on to describe why she was that way. This is in contrast to the kind of introduction you see in books like The Game of Thrones or Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, where you either jump right into getting to know the character personally, or you get background on the character without either a statement about who he is or a real introduction to him as a person, because infants don't have much in the way of interesting personality to those who aren't holding them. This statement of what to expect from Mary Lennox shapes how we see her, emphasizing the lines that agree with that statement and letting us gloss over the lines that are neutral or disagree with that. It makes her development from brat into not brat seem that much more gradual, since we're trained from the start to see her as a brat. Another thing I really like about this introduction is that we get the chance to see how Mary treats the people that are beneath her in the pecking order. I once read that you can always tell what kind of person someone is by how they treat people that can't defend themselves, whether those people are human or animal. No one will ever tell you that kind, sweet children pull the wings off of flies and laugh while they suffer, nor would anyone think that Mary Lennox is an understanding, mature child from how she treats the slaves in her parents' household. At the same time, her actions are understandable. Though beating a girl for not obeying when obedience is impossible is reprehensible, it makes sense that a 9-year-old girl would want the people she's used to, even if she isn't a very affectionate child. I think I'm going to give this beginning 4 stars out of 5 because it catches my interest, informs me about the character and the world, and gives me background information on the story. That said, I am biased in favor of this beginning and this story, so how would you rate this beginning? Let me know down in the comments. For today's random question of the day, if your favorite toy from childhood appeared among your things today, would you recognize it for what it was? Until next time, stay awesome, Inklings. I'll see you next week.